Alberta for the 15th Winter Olympic Games. It was just one more milestone in how the West was skied. The mind is in control. The upper body hesitates, the legs extend, pushing skis into unknown crystals before arcing, sending them free into the dry mountain air. The timing, the motion, the balance repeated as the skis counterpoint the rhythm of the skier. The exhilaration is amplified as the snow rushes down the steep slope to catch its attacker. But it wasn't always this smooth. Skiing was a sport that came without instructions. The body position was experimented with. The early equipment didn't help, but we can thank our skiing pioneers who persevered to develop a sport of quality and entertainment. In the early 30s, the skiers who skied the Skoki area of the Canadian Rockies were on par with skiers from other parts of the world. These slopes and snow conditions were considered to be the finest natural ski terrain in the world. Canadians, Cliff White, Peter and Catherine White, the Paris family, and photographer Brian Harmon. Austrian Vic Kachura, Norwegian Erling Strom were some of the early skiers who expanded the boundaries of skiing. One notable outing was the first cross-country trip from Jasper to Banff by Jasper skiers Vern and Doug Jeffrey, Joe Weiss, Frank Berstrom, and Peter Withers. Distance covered was 400 kilometers in 15 days. A later trip was taken by Cliff White, Joe Weiss, and American Russell Bennett. They took a side trip to ski Snowdome at the Columbia ice fields and were on the trail for 20 days. Skoki, just east of Lake Louise, was the forerunner to Western resorts. Although it didn't develop beyond this, it had the first cabin to accommodate overnight skiers, plus a very enthusiastic cook. But compare this with one of Europe's leading winter resorts of that time. St. Moritz, Switzerland in the 30s had been a winter resort for over 50 years. It catered to the wealthy, who spent their outdoor time skating and tobogganing, with perhaps a little curling. Although St. Moritz had hosted the second Winter Olympics in 1928, downhill skiing was rather slow to develop. As one writer of that time had said, while St. Moritz was the most social, it was possibly the least athletic of Swiss resorts. The writer, of course, would be referring to the wealthy visitors. St. Moritz became a winter attraction in 1864 when the owner of the Palace Hotel, on a bet, invited some of his wealthy English guests back for Christmas at his expense. If they found it to be too cold, he would return them to England. They apparently stayed until spring, and St. Moritz became an all-season resort. Meanwhile, back in North America, skiing was growing in popularity. One popular approach to instruction at that time was the Austrian Arlberg method as developed by Hannes Schneider. Kids, of course, didn't care too much for lessons. Besides, who wants to turn? One approach to skiing the Rockies in the 40s was just let them ride. The idea was to follow a good skier and hope that his talent would rub off on you. This was fine and worked with some people, but when it came to technical skiing, well, the basics were missing, the timing was missing, everything was missing. It was obvious a systematic approach to instruction had to be developed. The Canadian Ski Alliance set the standard and has through the years become a world leader in teaching people to ski. One person who influenced Canadian instructors was the late Ernie McCullough of Three Rivers, Quebec. He was also a first-class racer. In 1951, he became the only skier to complete a Grand Slam of major events by winning the National Giant Slalom at Utah, North American Championship at Aspen, the National Downhill at Whitefish, and the Harriman Cup at Sun Valley, Idaho. Through the years, a variety of methods were used for teaching. It was always well debated, but the goal was to make it easier and a happier experience for the pupil and the instructor. The Western instructor had to be able to teach skiers to handle a variety of conditions, from gentle slopes to heli skiing in the high country. That included people with disabilities, skiers who wanted to learn racing, serious skiers, and not so serious weekend skiers. Some who had doubts about the sport, to those who wanted to enjoy the pleasures of powder skiing. The ski instructors of all skiing nations gather every 4 years to show and share their methods. Canada has been a leader in this show, which is called Interski. It could be called the Instructors' Olympics. What a colorful display of skiing it was in 1987 when Canada hosted 26 countries at Banff. Western Canada has been fortunate to have had many foreign skiers move to our area. Some were hotel people, others were developers. A group that will always be remembered for their contribution to our mountain style of living are the Swiss guides of Lake Louise and Golden. In 1952, a young Austrian arrived in Alberta who was to have a great impact on the future of skiing in Alberta and British Columbia. Hans Moser, right from the start, seemed at home in the Rockies, climbing and guiding in the summer months. In the winter, his high country tours were popular. He developed a following that was to increase as he filmed these trips for his lecture series that were designed to promote his business as well as entertain Canadian and American audiences. His business literally took off in 1966 when he and a few friends experimented with a helicopter as a means to get to some untouched slopes. From an old logging camp in the Bugaboos, Hans Moser has built the largest and most successful heli-skiing operation in the world. Now operating from 3 specially designed lodges, plus 4 other locations, Canadian Mountain Holidays, as it is now called, has 7 helicopters carrying over 3,000 skiers annually who are willing to pay top dollars for this ultimate experience. A skiing Camelot built on service and honesty. Moser's literature has always told it how it is. The snow in these mountains is subject to change, you must realize that. But more than anything, his guests from around the world realize it is a skier's dream. A skiing experience in the 1940s, as it is today, was Mount Assiniboine, a remote area 50 kilometers west of Banff. No other area in the Rockies offers such an impressive backdrop. It is virtually unchanged since Erling Strom pioneered this area in 1928. 20 years later, Larry Boyd and Vail Teesmacky hosted the few skiers that were willing to ski the long trip in. At that time, Al Gates flew supplies in with his single-engine Tiger Moth. He might drop the supplies from the air, but if snow conditions permitted, he would land. A few years later, Lizzie Rummel was to buy Pat Brewster's cabin at Sunburst, which lies in the shadow of Mount Assiniboine. For the next 20 years, in summer and winter, she carried on a break-even business, welcoming new and old friends to her little cabin. A contrasting lifestyle from the wealthy Munich family she had been born into. In the Canadian Rockies, she wasn't known as Baroness von Rummel, just the ever-friendly Lizzie. The decade of the 50s wasn't what you would call a booming period for skiing. Very few ski areas grew in size, and virtually no new areas were developed. In the 60s, things changed. The search for new hills started. In Alberta, slopes on the eastern face of the Rockies were tested. Places like West Castle in the south. Further north was Snow Ridge, now called Fortress. Pigeon Mountain on the Trans-Canada Highway by Canmore was developed, but didn't survive. Happy Valley at Calgary. Rabbit Hill near Edmonton. Farming areas tried ski hills, one being Long Lake that had a vertical of 198 feet. There was Pascapoo, And who thought this would end up being called Olympic Park, site for the 1988 Olympic jumping events, as well as the luge and bobsledding? What was responsible for the development in the 60s? The Trans-Canada Highway was completed through the Rockies. Travel was made easier. It was also the start of the jet age. Skiers all of a sudden realized they could choose a resort in North America or Europe and be there the next day skiing. The major ski areas in Alberta and on the West Coast realized that if they were to compete on this world stage, they would have to update their areas with improved lifts and facilities. Following the 1960 Olympics in California, the number of skiers increased. It was also about that time when American Express introduced the charge card. It was a time for freer spending, and the ski areas were out to get their share. Skiers had to be kept happy, well-fed, and entertained.
Search until you tire, you won't find a bigger liar. I've been lying since the dawn of history.
In Jasper and Banff, big hotels that had been closing during the winter months had to be updated and winterized before they could welcome skiers. It was a whole new ball game, or rather, snowball game. The ski area managers had to be ready for more skiers, and with that came a greater variety of skiers. Beginners, intermediates, and expert skiers had to be catered to. The family was important. These were challenging times for families. Skiing was one sport that strengthened family ties. A day shared on the slopes was generally fun and a great equalizer for all members of the family. The ski areas in Banff and Jasper met the challenge within the limitations of the national park system and the objections as voiced by environmental groups. No matter how well ski hills are prepared or groomed, there comes a time when they run out of snow. At times like this, no one looks too good and control is out. The bottom line is snow. It is the most important ingredient, and area managers realize that, whether they're in charge in Alberta, British Columbia, or across the line in the United States in Colorado or Utah. The newest ski areas were developed for the 1988 Olympics. There is Olympic Park at Calgary. Mount Ellen at Nakiska on the eastern slope of the Rockies, about a 75-minute drive from Calgary or Banff, had its official opening in December of 1986. That was followed by events at the Nordic Center in Canmore, all geared up for competition now and later for recreational cross-country skiers. Off-season skiing, if there is such a thing, has always offered a different experience for those willing to try it. The skiers who climbed to the summer races on Mount Victoria at Lake Louise in the 50s and 60s will have memories of an outing that was generally a test. Sometimes had good snow, but always fun, and a nice break from the summer job. They were well-organized races and generally attracted some of the best skiers, but more than anything, they were skiers willing to climb for a midsummer run. A little attention to the old leather boots was a wise move for West Coast skiers that would take a train ride to the Garibaldi area for a little summer skiing. They knew the moisture of summer snow would quickly penetrate the surface of the boots. They too had their share of climbing. The overnight stay in a remote cabin was no hardship. It generally prompted more humor than one could stand. The snow was generally an unknown quality and quantity until you reached it, but it was always worthwhile. Still another off-season outing, which was more like a shootout at the OK Corral, was the early summer skiing at Parker's Ridge. Hundreds would turn out for these races. It was so popular, the Mounties would generally show up to check the action. The campgrounds along the Banff-Jasper Highway were pitched to capacity. These races produce stories that continue to grow and grow bigger each year. There was also some excellent skiing to be had, at least enough to bridge the gap between the winter seasons. It's great to experience today's fine equipment, the high-speed chairs and gondolas, But every once in a while, we think back to days that didn't have any of that and remember that it still was just as great. The small group was eager to get going, but really no rush. Besides, with this old Tucker snowcat, it was impossible to really rush. The slope is called Little Quartz and lies just beyond the Great Divide in the Sunshine area. This little mountain doesn't offer a challenging run, but the conditions that prevailed that morning were so nice, the less effort you put into your skiing, the better you felt. It was like being a kid again, playing with a big toy that could carry you to other worlds. It was just a little different then. It's a big difference now. But those are the ski days you remember, the ones that are just a little different. When the first Winter Olympics were held at Chamonix, France in 1924, the only skiing events were Nordic, jumping and downhill. The same was true at St. Moritz in 1928 and the Lake Placid Olympics of 1932. There was slalom and downhill at the Garmisch Games in 1936. However, medals were not given for the individual races, only the combined. The early downhill races in the 20s and 30s were mass starts. Everyone started at the same time. They were sometimes called the Geschmuggel start. Whatever you call it, it was hectic. Englishman Arnold Lunn, who operated a family travel business, catered to the wealthy English who wanted to ski the continent. He would stage races for them in a number of leading resorts. Arnold Lunn was officially given credit for inventing slalom racing in 1922. The Dominion Ski Championship held at Banff in 1937 also displayed some fine skiing, but on a much steeper slope. The starting position in the slalom was determined by your finish the previous day in the downhill. This system continued for the next 20 years. The Dominions, which was the Canadian Championship, was again held in Banff in 1940. By that time, they had added a new day lodge, which is still used today. The winners in 1940 of the Dominion title were Vancouver skiers Gertie Wepsela and Art Cole. Princeton in the British Columbia interior was an active ski area in the 30s, Nordic and alpine events being equally popular. They hosted the Westerns there in 1938. Mount Seymour on the west coast had an active club that was involved in pleasure skiing and racing. In the 1950s, at least in Alberta, there were not many ski clubs that could help their young racers financially. It was also a non-specializing time. If you entered a meet, you could be expected to do alpine and Nordic events. That's the way it was in 1959 when a talented Alberta team beat the rest of Canada to win the junior title. Some of North America's finest ski competitions started in Alberta in 1946. The annual International Collegiate Ski Meet was organized at that time by Bob Fries, Norm Ralt, and Professor Maury Van Vliet from the University of Alberta. This meet continued for 23 years. It provided excellent competition in alpine and Nordic events from the leading universities of the American and Canadian West. The Olympic Games of 1960 at Squaw Valley, California, were to see Canada win its second Olympic medal, both from the ladies. The first medal had been won by Lucille Wheeler at the 1956 Olympics in Cortina, Italy. She had a third in the downhill. At these games, Anne Hecteveit was to win a gold in the slalom. She won by 3 seconds, one of the most convincing victories recorded in Olympic competition. Also at the games were 4 members from CODA, Calgary Olympic Development Association. They had a bid in for the 1964 Olympics for Banff, but were actually hoping for the 1968 Games. When they didn't get them, they tried for the 1972 Winter Games, but failed again. The reason for defeat was due to the fact that Banff was in a national park.
Now it's ready? No? Yeah, as soon as he got in the sun, I didn't know you were. Of course, Ingi Sononi and Birgo Farbinger from Italy and Germany, they're top two skiers from those countries, so it's good for you.
This is certainly a feather in your cap, Nancy, and for the Canadian national team, our congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nancy Green was part of the Nelson experiment. In the early to mid-60s, the ladies and men of Canada's national team attended classes and trained at the Nelson University in Nelson, BC. Nancy Green went on to be the first overall World Cup winner in 1966-67. She repeated in 1967-68. At the Grenoble Olympic Games in 1968, she won a gold in the giant slalom and a silver in slalom. The Nancy Green League that followed her retirement introduced thousands of youngsters to the sport. It also inspired many to continue to ski and join racing programs across the country. On a provincial team, the training increases, the pressure increases, and the expenses increase. A summer camp might be suggested for further development, or if you're with the provincial team, it means autumn camps in France or Italy. Once Calgary had been awarded the Olympic Games for 1988, it was hoped that some young Albertan would peak at that time. The most likely skier to do that is Karen Percy of Banff, who will be in the Olympics skiing all disciplines. The Nordic people had an excellent program, and it's hoped they too will have a cross-country skier or jumper in the Games. Another form of skiing competition became popular in the early 70s, freestyle skiing. The early attempts at freestyle skiing might have started with freedom, but very little style. There were some very good Western Canadian skiers on the freestyle circuit in the early years. Two of the leading Canadians at that time were John Eves and Wayne Wong. In the 70s, if a streaker was to show up on the hill, it was generally at a freestyle event. Some racers who might have been on provincial teams or even national teams found a new outlet in pro racing. Here they were free from the rigid training and coach-controlled atmosphere that prevailed on those teams. The courses were short and fast. You had about 30 seconds to prove you could outski your opponent on these dual courses. Competition is competition. The skier who skis with a disability finds his opponent just as hard to beat as do World Cup racers. Disabled ski races have been a big part of the Western Canadian ski scene for the past 15 years. It's serious business on the hill, but nowhere will you find an award presentation with happier people. The World Cup races, as designed by Frenchman Serge Lang, starting in 1966, has been a pleasant experience for the Canadian ladies and men's team. The gals were the first to raise the cup. Nancy Green of Rossland, BC was not only the first to win a race for Canada, she won the overall title 2 years running. World Cup points have been won by many ladies. Jerry Sorensen of Kimberley, BC in 1982 had 2 victories and a 3rd finish. In 1986, Laurie Graham had 5 medals, 2 gold, 1 silver, and 2 bronze. You could ask 100 World Cup downhill racers, what is the most challenging course on the circuit, or the White Circus as some call it? Practically all will say the Strife on the Honnenkam at Kitzbühel, Austria. You win at Kitzbühel, you have won the best. It was a target for the Canadians, which they hit in a big way, having won 4 races here in 4 years. Reed in 1980, Podborski in 1981 and 82, and Brooker in 83. The Austrians didn't believe it. This race in 1979 at Kitzbühel had just 3 crazy Canucks. Dave Irwin was injured and Jim Hunter had retired in 1977. Ken Reed will enter the odd slalom race as he did here at Kitzbühel. Just outgunning for a few extra World Cup points for the overall World Cup. He had opposition in Ingmar Stenmark of Sweden and U.S. skier Phil Mayer. All the crazy Canucks have retired now, but they still meet each year at Lake Louise for the Reed Invitational. They fly in from all over the country to compete in a dual slalom. The event is used as a fundraiser for cystic fibrosis. They don't forget, and sports-minded people of Canada, including many people in Europe, will never forget the crazy Canucks. But what of the Olympic course on Mount Allen? Will it favor the present Canadian team? Will it favor anyone? So far, from the races that were held there in the first winter, it looks like it will be more to the liking of the gliders. Peter Mueller, the big Swiss, who is an excellent glider, won a World Cup downhill there. Whatever happens, Nakiska will be remembered as the area specially designed for the 15th Winter Olympics. The next chapter in Canadian skiing is about to unfold as a new group of young skiers take over. They are a new breed ready to challenge the mountains of the West and courses of the world in their own way. And when they retire, there will be another group to carry on our Western Canadian skiing heritage. It's for certain they will carry on in yet another way from those who went before them. But the excitement of skiing will always be there. Each generation just changes it a little to keep it fresh.